as well, David. I mean, it's
Yeah.
Zoom makes it easier from a podcast.
There's a problem. Their share price has been taking a bit of a battering of late because. Yeah,
you're right. Okay, so we're recording, Rich. Okay, very good. You can edit the little bit at the beginning. Okay, so welcome everybody to yet another brilliant episode of the Places We'll Go show. And today we've got, I'd say, somebody I've known for quite a while, David James. I met David in 2014, and I have to confess, another Marketing Academy Fellowship alumni peer. And so great to have you on the show, David.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks so much for having us, Mark. Lovely to see you and Richie in person.
Yeah, well, we know that you've listened to a few of the shows, so this is you're the other side of the fence today. So as I said, I've known David for a few years. David is Chief Marketing and Corporate Affairs Officer for Hargreaves Lansdown, has been for about 3 years. But before that has had quite an illustrious marketing career, as you'd expect for people who come on the show. He was Commercial and Marketing Director at Vodafone for 3 years. And before that, Marketing Director at BT for about 5 years. So lots of heavyweight senior experience. But actually, David started his career as a financial advisor. And when I did approach David about this, he very humbly said, would my story be interesting enough? Which is actually, in all honesty, a few guests say, because we do like to have people who sort of, fairly grounded, but nonetheless successful. My answer was unequivocally yes, because actually, David, you've achieved some amazing things, but very much not in a flashy or braggy way, which is particularly endearing. And of course, we all know for you, it hasn't, and for all our guests, it hasn't been perfect. You've had to work hard to create a lot of your own opportunities. And so we'll go all the way back to sort of what's made you who you are and how you've been successful. So I think we're in for a thriller. And so without further ado, I'll hand over to Richie to get us started.
Awesome. There we go. I've used your words, David. But it's just absolutely brilliant to have you on the show this morning. I'm going to get right in there, to be honest with you, and just going to pick up on what Mark said. How on earth do you go from financial advisor to chief marketing officer? I mean, how does that happen?
Yeah, gosh, that's a long story, isn't it, Richie? So kind of, I guess I didn't start as a financial advisor. I was listening actually to Annette King, and I think I'm quite good friends with Annette, and I'm probably about a similar age. And she was talking about how she entered from university into the graduate market in like a really bad market, and the milk round wasn't very popular at that time. But I managed to successfully get onto one of the very few graduate places that were available at the time with NatWest. I think there were 10,000 applicants for 100 jobs or something. Feel very fortunate to have kind of got that one of those kind of early grad career jobs. I was on the grad program it was a 2-year program, and I broke off it after about 1.5 years because I thought it was a bit slow. And I saw that I could get a car if I became a financial advisor. So I ended up with this is like how not to do a career right from the start, which is like base your career decisions on whether you get a dark aubergine Ford as your car. But I'd never had a brand new car before, and I was so excited. And everyone said, "Oh, you can't leave the comfort of the graduate program. You've worked. You're super lucky to be on it, and you're going and doing a high risk job with kind of corporate targets, and you're going to be measured, and there's proper people who know what they're doing that you're up against." But for me, it felt like a bit of a challenge, so I leaped into that one. So that was the sort of springboard, and actually getting into marketing. I did a marketing degree, so I've had a marketing a bit in my blood, but I came to the end of my financial advisor career, and I'd been pretty successful at it, and hence NatWest gave me a few opportunities for interviews, and I went and did 3 interviews in London with different leaders, and ended up liking this one in marketing the best. And I ended up very quickly in the student and graduate marketing world. So I was out there doing cash incentives at universities and things like that to try and bring in the students, and then nurture them through graduates into like full-time banking. So that was the sort of springboard into marketing. And then I guess like there's a long wiggly path, as Mark describes, between there and here today. But that's the sort of exact summary of it.
So the I love that. It was just too slow, because often graduate schemes are pretty fast paced, and I think it talks to the fact that you do like a challenge, and are prepared to take a bit of risk. So is that sort of quite natural to you to be able to jump into the risky situations?
Yeah, I think it's one of my top tips, particularly when you're younger and you haven't got quite so much responsibility. What is there to lose? Yeah, I kind of like. I think you've got to be brave in some of the early decisions you make in your career. It gets, the important lesson is it gets harder to make brave decisions the older and more senior you get. You get lots of you get to some degree kind of lulled into a lifestyle. You've got families to support, and you have incentive options and things like that which mature in many years' time. So it's actually take your risks earlier, I would say, to springboard your career into the future.
What a great piece of advice. It's so easy to get comfortable and have expectations and responsibility. So served you well, you have to say, in the round. Sorry, Richie, back to you.
I've got it's interesting, and I wholeheartedly agree with that advice. But I also wonder, and I'm in a position where all of us are really, where we get to speak to friends in sort of more senior positions. And I think there is certainly a sense of they wish either they had done, or the thought that they would like to be slightly more risk-taking in today's context. And yet, like you say, the golden handcuffs exists, and they've got other responsibilities to think about as well. So I guess I would just ask, is there, and how is there, a way that perhaps even later in your career can you still maintain that sense of enthusiasm for risk?
Yeah, I think kind of to be fair, I've probably taken some nuts risks and some well-considered risks later in my career. I mean, the latest one, moving to Hargreaves Lansdown, it wasn't the obvious move. I mean, when I left financial services, I did 7 years at all in all. The first time round, I said, I'm not going to go back. I want to go do something a bit more sexy or whatever. And then ended up in some pretty decent jobs, like launching BT Sport, launching Voxy for BT and Vodafone, working TV a little bit. Even broadband is quite an interesting sector, and kind of like telco media and entertainment, I think was a really exciting kind of time, and I had some fantastic opportunities and some great roles there. But it's just actually going back into financial services is a bit of a risk, to be honest, from the perspective of I hadn't done it for a long time, and the whole world's changed and it's incredibly regulated now, and B, it's not quite as obviously sexy as running BT Sport marketing. So, to a degree that was a risk, but I did it because I felt like I was adding bows to my string, with the sort of an ex-co job in a FTSE 100 company. I'd not really got much board experience, and I thought, to further my career, I needed to kind of try that out and see if I was any good at it. Obviously, working in a more regulated environment to see if I could manage that. But I loved Hargreaves Lansdown. I loved the story. I've met Peter Hargreaves many times, and fascinating company that really serves its clients brilliantly well. And it didn't feel like going back into the financial services I'd left. It felt like going into an entrepreneurial company that had been one of the big success stories of the UK. Started in Steve and Peter's garage almost, and kind of built up to be a FTSE 50 company when I joined.
I just have to ask very quickly. So you said determine whether you're any good at it. Are you any good at it? Did you figure that answer out?
I don't think I'm the right person to. I don't think I'm still here, so I don't think I'm necessarily the right person to answer that. But mind you, Mark, obviously Penny, your boss, is on our board, so maybe she'd have a better perspective on that. I think all I can judge that by is I'm still here. And I've got really good relationships with the non-execs and my boss, Chris Hill, who's the CEO, and so I do my best. I think I talk a little bit too much sometimes, and that's one of my lessons is kind of succinct communications to the board, because it's not like with the CEO where I've got like a very deep, I have long sessions, we understand each other very well. When you're with the board, you're in there for a short periods of time. you've got to make an impact, you've got to have a clear story, you've got to answer their questions succinctly, and you've got to do a bit of stakeholder management before and after. And those, as long as you get those kind of right, you know, it's not too tricky. We've got a great board, very, you know, really impressive board. They're quite challenging, but you know, it's really interesting to deal with them, and you learn such a lot, don't you? I was thinking, like, it's developmental. That's what I wanted, you know. So I wanted to be stretched, and you know, when you've got people like Mark's boss Penny, and you know, all sorts of experts from the industry, and our chair is Deanne Oppenheimer, who's chair of many large companies, and you know, they're super impressive people, and you can't help but learn from them.
Yeah, I mean, it's going back to the beginning of the answer. I was going to get all defensive about how sexy financial services is or isn't, but then I got over myself. I got over myself. But anyway, I mean, you've landed in a plum place, because there's not many FTSE 50 companies that even have anything like resembling a marketing exco level role. So you're a pretty rare breed, and so I mean, there's things that come with that. So they're really genuinely running the business. So how do you sort of balance your time across, you know, the marketing stuff versus, you know, actually you're helping to define the future of the company?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's switched over the 3.5 years I've been there, because I initially way more time with marketing, because you know, when I arrived, it was, you know, for such a brilliant company and such a brilliant place with lots of young people working there, the engagement wasn't brilliant. I think for marketing, we were in the second lowest department in the company, and you know, there were lots of problems to fix. We had poor diversity. I think it was 33% female representation, and it just was not, you know, it wasn't a brilliant place to work. So I had to, and it didn't really plan ahead very much. There was this part of the entrepreneurial background, was that it kind of lived in the moment, which is great, you know, living in the moment, everyone recommends, but it's not always best when you're trying to run a marketing department. So early days, putting in plans, finding out who the real talent were, getting them to the front of the business, you know, changing out where necessary to people who are really talented, building out that diversity mix. We're now like over 50% female, and we've got some brilliant kind of like female leaders now in, and one more on the way very soon. So, you know, over the time, building up that backbone in the marketing department has allowed me to have more and more time to dedicate to strategy. I keep getting extra little bits added onto my job, and so board management, in working with the boards, and doing extra bits and bobs. Like we recently did a capital markets day, and I ran a bit of the strategy lead up to that, and that was something I've never done before, would never have got the opportunity to do in some of the bigger companies, physically, you know, sort of the BTs and the Vodafones of this world. So yeah, it is like, but I think you just have to get great people around you, and then you've got time to do other stuff. I think that's the only way all these, I was listening again to a couple of the other podcasts last night, people who have been much more successful than me, managing many big companies and so on, and it's just about getting great people around you. That gives you the time to do lots of stuff.
David, it's admirable the way that you talk about yourself, in the sense of how humble you are. I mean, quite honestly, there's not many people have come on in your position in onto the show before as well. So we're grateful to have you. I wanna and also just to say what a great sort of transformation you've been on in the last couple of years across the department as well. That's no easy feat by any stretch of the imagination. I want to take you back a little bit, because you did say that of the X number of thousand people who applied for that graduate program in NatWest, you were one of the lucky ones, and that's brilliant. And I just wondered if you perhaps over the years have been able to put your finger on a little bit about maybe what is that magic sauce, and I guess as part of that, when you're thinking about future talent to come work for you in your department, what are the kind of key things that maybe you'd be looking for?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's sort of, I was a little bit surprised I got into that program, so I'm not sure I've got the answer to that. But you know, there were quite a few notable people on that program. So my wife was one who also got into it, as was my next door neighbour, a bit name droppy, but my next door neighbour at the moment, Alison Rose, who's now the group CEO of NatWest. So she started in the same graduate intake as me. So
Wow.
if there's anything that you need for being humbling, is living next door to someone who has been enormously more successful than you. So she lived the dream that we will kind of pitched, which is you could be CEO one day if you join this program. Yeah, so Rich, just repeat the question. I was kind of got carried away with the graduate program story.
Well, I'll say what a wonderful neighbor to have, quite frankly. Do you go up to her and ask her for tips or anything? But
no, it's mainly about kind of like her gardener blowing leaves over into my garden. But yeah,
brilliant. Now, I was just sort of wondering around, perhaps, what do you think kind of got you into that position? Maybe what are the characteristics or things that you brought to the table which enabled you to get on, and then perhaps translating that into when you're recruiting now for young talent, what are the kind of things you look for?
So sort of I think I think one of my big tips as always is be really good at one thing and like sort of really build that skill. Get rid of your face. I went on this training, it's called the Extraordinary Leader, and it was all about building out your main strength and getting rid of your fatal flaw. And that's all you really need to do to become really successful. And people are only famous for one thing. So I've always been pretty innovative by nature. I'm an inventor on the side, and I've got some quite successful inventions. But kind of like I was always very creative, less creative than my siblings, by the way. Some of them are like artists and stuff like that. So, but kind of pretty creative at heart. And I think I probably brought a bit of a different story to something like that milk round, where I was able to kind of combine that. I did a marketing and maths degree basically, which is quite unusual for a creative guy, I suppose. And consequently, I was able to sort of bring both sides of. And I hear a lot of people in marketing, and particularly in these kind of jobs, talk about the fact that they're quite good at balancing commercial and creativity. And so I think probably that was a little bit of my edge in getting onto that. I was also enormously competitive. I've got some very interesting two competitive stories from my early life, but kind of very, very competitive and driven, and hopefully, although quietly spoken, sort of quite passionate about what I do, and hopefully that came across, I guess, even back then. But I was incredibly shy back then. So again, I'd sort of surprised myself, because whenever it was like one of those round table kind of meetings, I never used to speak. I was always the last person, and I'd always got millions of brilliant points in my head, and I couldn't get them out. And I was like, damn, I should have got those brilliant points out. Everyone else is like up there jumping around. But I forced myself in that milk round interview to go to the board and like take the board, because I'd been given that as a tip for someone who's like, a bit shy in terms of how do you create a presence, create a role. So I gave myself a role, which was basically in end, you end up like looking a bit like the leader if you're up at the board. So yeah, that probably was a little bit of a technique.
Good tip. Now, we need to go a little bit deeper on the inventiveness and the competitiveness. Let's start with the inventiveness. So you've got some successful invention. I didn't know anything about this at all. So what's your invention streak? Tell us about that.
So yeah, I've got probably 100 or so ideas in a folder somewhere, but some of them have seen the light of day. And the one that's been most successful is called the Jet Rest. It's a travel pillow, and it's one of the best-selling travel pillows in the world, actually. And it's been selling for 20 years now, I think, roughly. But I licensed it to a company, and it all kind of came about because I was working in America for NatWest. And traveling back and forth a lot. I was in economy. I couldn't really get to sleep. I tried every travel pillow in the market. They're all useless. So, and the U-shaped ones, I kind of went, they don't really work. They're not ergonomically well designed. So I learned a bit about ergonomics, studied it on the side. And then I sort of created these various iterations of prototypes that started off being like a strap that strapped a pillow onto the seat, like when you roll a pillow up and against a wall. So I thought, well, if I strap something on, and then I realized the strap went across the person's TV behind you, and I was like, oh, that's not going to work. So I created what I called the Mobius strap, which was like a figure-of-8 strap that went around the corners of the seat, and that you still had to interact with the person behind you when I was trialing this, and it was still a bit awkward. So I redesigned it backwards basically, and eventually ended up with this thing that was like I cut pillows up, and I got the tailor in the building I had in New York at the time to kind of like stitch it together, and I put it in a pillowcase so people couldn't see what it was, and tried different shapes, and eventually I got to a shape where it sort of performed like it was like a bit more like an L shape than a U shape, and it performed like rolling up a jumper and putting it against the wall both sides, but you had like contouring in the back of your neck, and it rolled up and velcroed, and I did an inflatable one, and eventually got it manufactured in China and then licensed it to a company that's been selling. I remember one of the biggest moments in my whole life from a career perspective was walking to Harrods and seeing a wall of these things, from the cheap ones down the bottom, which in those days were 20 quid, and then they had the cashmere ones on the top layer, which were £100. I think they're now 50 quid and like £8.95 or something online. But kind of back in the day, that was sort of, it's one of those moments where you go, the sort of, this was nothing, it wasn't, it certainly wasn't, it wasn't a job, it didn't exist, it was not even an idea. I took it all the way through, and I patented it in the US, and I wrote most of the patent myself. And it was just one of those things where I learned a little bit about being an entrepreneur, and this has always been a struggle for me, because I've kind of had this duality of, do I carry on in my corporate career, or do I go invent stuff and work with inventors? Because that's my sort of I suppose passion. So I love design and creating stuff, and so on. So that's sort of part of the inventing story. But there's many more ideas that have yet to see the light of day.
Wow,
what a brilliant story! And you do face a genuine conflict, because it's not just pipe dream stuff; it's stuff that's commercially viable. So I'd be love to see inside that folder of ideas. But Richie.
no, I mean, it is absolutely fascinating, and absolutely probably never heard a story like that before in all the shows that we have done, and we're certainly approaching up to 100. So it's really, really fascinating. And I want to dig in a little bit into that duality around entrepreneurship versus corporate life, because as you say, it probably is quite a dilemma in your mind. But what keeps you on the corporate track?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I mean, there's a good example. Like probably the main reason I went to Hargreaves Lansdown was because it felt like a more entrepreneurial company than, say, a Vodafone or a BT. It was really funny, my early interviews with Peter Hargreaves. He's like, where have you worked before? BT, Vodafone, oh my God, you're not going to fit in here. But because the moment when I started talking about some of this entrepreneurial stuff I'd done on the side, he sort of warmed up to me a little bit, I think. But that was it. It was an entrepreneurial, and it still is. It's still got an entrepreneurial thread that runs through it. It's obviously got massive now, but it's still got that like client's obsession at the heart of what it does, and it's also got this entrepreneurial nature, and trying to keep that as the company scales, I think, is a really interesting challenge. Vodafone was a really entrepreneurial company one day. It was a very big corporate now, and it hasn't kept any of that entrepreneurial edge? I don't know. It doesn't feel like it so much. Whereas HL does still have a entrepreneurial edge, and entrepreneurialism is valued, and so on.
Brilliant.
So the other thing you mentioned was about competitiveness. So you can see that there's a sort of steely determination to get things done, but in a very sort of humble way. If we go all the way back, what are some of the events that shaped you into the person that you've become?
Yeah, so I kind of I was a council house kid, and it's really interesting. I always thought, oh, that's an interesting story. I was a council house kid, and I've done all right. And but then I've listened to a lot of the podcasts. It's quite a lot of the people who've been on, and they've gone, oh, I started in a working class background. You interviewed Simon recently, who we both know quite well, Mark, and I never heard that story about his dad and things like that, and how he was there when they came to repossess stuff into his house as a kid. And I'm going, like, actually my story is probably that interesting. But I was a council house kid, and I didn't really have much as a kid, but I had lots of ambition, and I was very competitive. And for some reason I was pretty decent at sport and things like that. So that drove my passion, and I kind of but I was overly competitive as a kid. And that manifested in my tennis career, which was I played a little bit of sort of small county level tennis when I was a kid, and my parents used to come and watch me, and I was all right when I was winning, but when I was losing, my competitive edge turned dark. And I was remember once I was at a competition and I was up against this person for the first time. They rocked up and they were sponsored, and they had like all these rackets in the bag, and I had my sort of wooden tennis racket I bought myself, and they had these carbon fiber Prince tennis rackets. And anyway, this chap demolished me basically, and I wasn't very happy about it. So I threw my one wooden tennis racket over the small crowd there was there into the car park, and my parents got up basically and left me there, and I had to find my own way home. So that was where competitive edge went a bit far. So I've learned over the years how to kind of like temper my my competitive nature to be something that's a bit more constructive. But yeah, so it's always been there. I'm still pretty competitive today, but hopefully in a bit more of a managed style.
Well, I think sometimes it's good to be, to have that sort of oomph about you. David, just be conscious. Your microphone's ruffling against your t-shirt, and I think that's what's causing a bit of friction. That's fine. So I want to talk a little bit about that, because particularly you created a great visualization in my mind when you talk about a wooden tennis racket versus the all singing, all dancing, one of your competitors. And I mean, how do people deal with that? Because often, we are found in David versus Goliath situations. And how would you then, and particularly even in your entrepreneurial endeavors and inventions, it'd probably be a similar ilk, where you talked about even the tailor in your building and cutting things up and then sewing it together. How are you able to kind of take a position like that and still win? Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, so obviously that day I didn't. So so I just got the bus home. But like since then, I think that my best like David Goliath story, it's not quite David Goliath because it was BT Sport, and it was obviously backed by BT, which is when I ran it, had the third largest marketing budget in the UK. However, kind of like when we went into sport, we were kind of like the David against Sky's Goliath in sport, and there've been some very well documented failures preceding it in terms of people taking on Sky, including BT. There was the first version of BT Sport that was launched when there was some regulation that enabled us to sort of retail Sky Sports channels to our clients, and Sky basically just unravels our proposition in public, in the media. And I was in the team at the time, but I wasn't the marketing director, but saw it all happening. And then the second thing was ESPN had like just, I mean, and ESPN's an amazing brand, sports brand around the world, and kind of they'd failed to basically dent Sky on the UK sport market. And so it was like, we felt like definitely we were up against Goliath when we were trying to launch BT Sport. But I learned so much about what the Sky tactics were when we kind of basically lost the first time round, even though I was marketing director at the time we launched BT Sport, and it was sort of had the hands on the wheels and so on. But we knew they were going to come up really hard against us in the marketing and try and unravel our proposition. So the big innovation we did was we started advertising BT Sport like probably 6 weeks before the season started, and I know that was a big strategic decision internally and I had to fight for that one, but because we did that, we'd established the brand, and because everyone went, why would you do that? Like, no one's buying sport at this time, it's in mid-season, in between the seasons or whatever, but it was like, well, it's a chance to establish the brand in that gap before Sky got to unravel our proposition. And that's exactly what happened. We got 6 weeks of clear air marketing. We landed the proposition amongst target audience. We got 80% awareness of the proposition in that really short period of time, and that was a David and Goliath story, and the sort of the rest is history. I mean, we overtook Sky in terms of overall subscribers, including pubs and clubs, within I think a year or so. So that's my best example but it felt like, we were able to win by employing kind of learnings and understanding about what had gone before us, and applying some intelligent, slightly counterintuitive tactics, I suppose, to land it, and having a brilliant proposition and loads of brilliant people behind it.
Yeah. Again, that sort of yin yang of understanding where creativity and commerciality meet. I've mentioned about you and I were on the Marketing Academy Fellowship, and we've had a ton of people through Sherilyn's path. I wanted to just pick at that a little bit in terms of the role that relearning, re-educating, pivoting, new insights has provided in your career. You can talk a bit about that year, but more generally, how have you kept yourself fresh and learning?
Yeah, that was really interesting. I loved that time with the academy, and meeting all of you guys and girls on that. Is you can't help but learn loads and loads about different industries, different challenges. One thing that was interesting though was kind of from a Myers-Briggs perspective, quite a lot of the people in that group were very similar, ENTP. Can you hear me still?
Still there, David?
We can.
Yeah, can you hear me
We've lost you. We've lost you on the visuals.
Sorry, and my kind of, I'm getting being asked to log in at the moment. Should we just carry on then without the visuals?
Absolutely.
Apologies.
That's fine.
Yeah, can you see me again now?
Yes.
Yeah, apologies.
Okay.
Authentication problems. So you can't help but learn off those brilliant people, and all of their experiences. And Sherilyn's put on an amazing program there, and now around the world is super success model, and kind of like the whole premise of it, marketing, remember, is, how do you get marketers to be CEOs? And it's sort of like, I think there's that whole, it's actually a change to be a CEO. And kind of my feeling coming out of that was actually, it was just a transition, because actually marketing isn't just making ads, it's much more than that. It's about running the business. And increasingly, it is, Peter Hargreaves says this about Hargreaves Lansdown, the business was marketing, it was all about marketing. And therefore there is, it's just a journey, and understanding that journey, and understanding if you want to be on that or not, and whether you love doing creative stuff and communications, or whether you like running P&Ls, dealing with difficult stakeholders and so on. So I found that sort of career evolution really fascinating. And I've also you learn what you like and don't like as you go as well, because I don't think everything's for me.
Yeah. David, it's interestingly, I get a great sense from you that you learn a lot from other people, and you really do try and understand people, and then sort of take the essence of them and try and build it into your own style and the own way that you go about your leadership approach. And to that extent, I wondered what's your point of view on the role of mentors in both your career and potentially others as they're coming through?
I think that's really interesting, Richie, and I know you do some brilliant work on that, UK leading work on that. From my perspective, I've not had a huge amount of formal mentoring, but I've had some unbelievable on-the-job mentors, and so probably all the way through in each job I've had. So BT, that was John Petter and Gavin Patterson, who are my bosses there, through Vodafone with Cindy Rose now at Microsoft, and also Glafkos Persianis. And to date, I've already mentioned Chris Hill, CEO of Hargreaves Lansdown, and Deanne Oppenheimer, the chair of Hargreaves Lansdown. These people are unbelievable. They've had much more successful careers than me. I constantly learning, have learned, and I'm learning from them. And I found that sort of, it's quite hard to kind of get that deep understanding of each other in a sort of formal mentoring program. But when you're on the job with people who are just amazing, you kind of you can't help but learn, and they give you tips and they give you challenges, and they occasionally give you tough feedback. I think that's just been brilliant. And then I've got sort of informal people who I respect and are sort of kind of friends with in the industry, who also give us brilliant kind of guidance, and like the fellowship folk like Mark, Simon, and others who are on that program, always inspirational, and you're able to bounce ideas off and hear about their stories and kind of like learn from them. So I think that sort of I think formal mentoring has a role. I've not received a lot of it, but I've really got loads out of informal mentoring. I've done quite a lot of formal mentoring of other people, and I just really enjoy it. I always think that I probably get twice as much out of it as the mentee, and that's, as long as they get half as much as me, it's probably been worthwhile, because you get such a lot out of it as a mentor. I've sort of developed a little bit of a approach, if you like. I don't know if it works, but it's kind of my view of like how I understand what people want out of life and where they are in the thing, and some of the tips. I've got like these 6 tips or whatever that I use of things that have worked for me, and they won't necessarily work for everybody, but yeah, it's just fascinating mentoring people. There's so much talent out there, and I've recently been working on this government social diversity task force, and again, it's like my favorite thing is finding hidden talent. And the whole thing in financial services is really, really poor socioeconomic diversity. Even the BAME folk who are making it through in financial services come from privileged backgrounds by and large. So it's finding that sort of lower socioeconomic talent that's a bit hidden and unlikely to make it through, and particularly coming from that sort of council house background, I think I've got a bit of a vibe with those people. So that's what I think mentoring can really do. And we've been doing some really interesting stuff at the grassroots level in Hargreaves Lansdown, you know, with the things like the Black Interns programs that run. And it is about kind of like, you know, all about finding those hidden talents. And my favourite example is what Vodafone did. They've got this program in Africa where they've actually built a university. They fund it from the revenues of one of the revenue lines out there. And they go around Africa and they find these underprivileged kids who have basically got nothing but have got a real spark, and then they bring them into this university and they turn them into, you know, amazing future leaders. And I went out there for a trip, and God, that was inspiring. And they all had about ambitions. They had like proper ambitions. They wanted to be the prime minister, and they wanted to be brain surgeons. And, you know, these are kids who, you know, didn't actually have, you know, access to water in their childhood. So that's the sort of power of like helping find talent. And I think mentoring is a brilliant way of doing that.
What a brilliant answer, with so much more depth than I think we've ever had before. Amazing. You've mentioned much more successful than me, and you've used the word success quite a lot, and you've talked about competitiveness. I'm interested if you've distilled a definition of success. What is success to you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, making positive change happen is success, you know, kind of. So I was trying to take my own personal brand of that, because I always like to put the inventing bit in there, is inventing a better future for me and my family. You know, that's my sort of personal goal. But it's all about that, make positive change happen. That feels like success. And if your team like do it rather than you doing it, that's even better, you know. And if you've got a talented team where, you know, it was still, the success still happens when you're not there and when you've gone, you know, that is real success. Teaching people to fish rather than being a fisherman, and that for me is like, yeah, true success.
David, that's fantastic, and I think what a lovely note to end on. It's been a wonderful session, and we've learned so much about you. It's been incredible. It really has. And you know, all the way from what people perhaps perceive of a FTSE 50 CMO of a financial services company is just such an antithesis of what it actually is, of what you are. And it's really, really cool. And it's been really refreshing. Both myself and Mark have had stints in financial services, and obviously Mark still does today. But I would certainly say that you're a very atypical CMO in that environment, and no wonder you've had all the successes that you've had, which you're so humble about. So just, you know, want to say a massive thank you from me. I'll pass over to Mark for some of his key takeaways, but it's been an absolute pleasure and joy to have you on.
Yeah, I mean, Richie, you capture it well. Sort of atypical, but in a thoroughly good and decent way. I'm left with two visual images. One of you sort of sleeping on flights and getting all fidgety and restless, and then spawning the jet rest, which I'm now going to go and check out and probably buy. And then also like a John McEnroe-esque strop hurling a tennis racket, probably quite a long way. I mean, and you know, not to be too sort of parental about it.
It was a small crowd, Mark.
You really could have hurt somebody. But anyway, but no, I mean, what a lovely session. So many things in there. I mean, a lot about taking risks and being brave, and that thought of being brave in the early part of your career, because it gets harder. That's very relatable. But there's a real humility that runs through you. Am I any good at? Will I be any good at this? Will I be successful? People have been loads more successful than me. Well, I'm not so sure, because some of the people that you've mentioned have been very successful in a narrow way. And I think you've been much broader than that. You talked about your humble beginnings and how that spurred you on, and that competitive streak that we talked about. But what a lovely, humbling experience that you have still been able to thrive and be yourself in a financial services FTSE 50 CMO role. As I said before, it's a rare breed. And on the face of it, you've nailed it. And I'm really interested. We've run out of time. I'm really interested about where does this go for you in the future, and maybe that's a subsequent chat. But for now, thank you, David. It's been a brilliant interview. Thank you, and for giving your time.
Thanks so much for having us. Great to finally see you in person, Richie. And like, I'm a massive fan of the show, as you know. And you know, as you say, I counted like you are definitely close to 100 of these, and that's massively inspiring. And there's so many great stories in there. And thanks so much for having me on the show. As I say, I don't know that I deserve to be on it, but kind of it's been great to spend some time with you.
Thank you so much.